Our first speaker to look at General Emmet Dalton and his contribution is Sean Boyne. Now, Sean, a couple of years ago, produced the first biography of Emmet Dalton, which analysed his contribution, his key contribution to the conflict, to the creation of the National Army and to its performance. And Sean was eminently qualified to produce that biography. As having been educated at O'Connell Schools and UCD with a degree in history and politics, he worked for quite a long number of years as a journalist, and as part of his journalism, he was also the defence correspondent with James's International or Information Group. Apart from the biography of Emmet Dalton, he recently produced a book, a wonderful book on an incident in the War of Independence, the killing of Bridget Noble on the Beara Peninsula, one of 3 women killed during the War of Independence, or executed during the War of Independence. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. I know it's a bit of a digression from what we're talking about today, but it's a wonderful book on a micro study of an incident in the War of Independence, and that is the murder of Bridget Noble. But today, he's going to talk about Emmet Dalton, and it's given me great pleasure to introduce Sean. Sean.
It's a great honour to be here today, and I'd like to thank Pat for the invitation to speak here and for those very kind words. I've long been fascinated by the varied career of Emmet Dalton. In fact, my fascination goes back to my childhood in 1950s Dublin when I saw a film being made. He'd launched Ardmore Studios, and I saw James Cagney on the Dublin docks, and an old armoured car, which I later learned was a Slieve na Mon, which was with Collins and Dalton at the ambush in Bain na Blah, in which Collins was killed. I went to O'Connell School, where Dalton went himself, and one of the brothers there in my time, Brother Alan, a great archivist, had also known Dalton extremely well, I would discover. Although I have to say that during my 10 years on O'Connell's, from 1953 to 1963, the Civil War was never mentioned. We were told about 1916, the War of Independence, and even though Dalton and Ernie O'Malley had been past pupils, they lived near each other on the north side of Dublin, and this conflict was never referred to. And I was amazed to find out that Ernie O'Malley at one stage during the Civil War put out a hit on his former schoolmate and neighbour, Emmet Dalton. What struck me as extraordinary about Dalton was that he was a major general in the Free State Army. He played a crucial role in the Civil War. He commanded thousands of men, and he was aged only 24 years. Somebody once referred to him as the boy general of the Free Staters. Born in Fall River, Massachusetts, I better start using this. That's the cover of the book I wrote. Born in Fall River, Massachusetts, he was brought to Dublin as a young boy by his Irish-American parents. Emmet's father, James F. Dalton, was a supporter of John Redmond's Irish Parliamentary Party. And as a second lieutenant with the Royal Dublin Fusiliers during the Great War, he received the Military Cross for bravery at the Battle of the Somme. He served with the Leinster Regiment in Salonika, Palestine, France and Flanders, and attained the rank of captain. At one stage, he was an instructor in a sniping school at El Arish in the Sinai Desert. His experience of the British Army's infantry manoeuvre tactics would prove useful when he oversaw operations during the conventional phase of the Civil War. He was also, as it turned out, a natural leader of men, and this would also be a vital asset in his military career. After the Great War, through his younger brother Charlie, who was now in the IRA, he was invited to give talks on military matters to IRA members, ultimately becoming Director of Training in IRA GHQ during the War of Independence. While there were some very competent officers at GHQ, Dalton stood out because he had previous conventional military experience, which some of the others lacked. He formed a close bond with Intelligence Chief Michael Collins, who brought him to London as an advisor during the treaty talks with the British. And when the Republican movement split over the treaty, he stayed loyal to Collins and became Director of Training in the new National Army, or Free State Army, as it became known. And there he is in Free State Army uniform. At the end of June 1922, Dalton, now a Major General and Director of Operations in the fledgling Army, commanded the 18-pounder field guns supplied by the British that bombarded the anti-treaty IRA garrison at the Four Courts in Dublin. The embryonic National Army did not have an artillery corps at this stage, and Dalton himself had no previous experience of operating a field gun. A British officer is reported to have given instructions to the provisional government on how to operate the guns. Mistakes were still made during the siege, but as time went on, National Army gunners would become quite proficient in operating the 18-pounders. You can see where their aim wasn't terribly good, with a couple of chunks knocked out of the Liffey wall there. Dalton's war campaign, and that of the Free State Army generally, was greatly aided by the fact that the British supplied material to equip the new military force, including armoured cars, armoured troop carriers, lorries and field guns. And we can see some of the equipment that was supplied here, a couple of field guns and armoured Lancia troop carriers. The National Army thus had heavy equipment that the Republicans lacked, and also greater mobility. Essentially, the Free Staters outgunned the IRA, even though in the early stages of the conflict, the IRA nationally deployed more men than the National Army could muster. As the National Army rapidly expanded, Dalton had an important role in organising recruitment and training. And at the behest of Commander-in-Chief Michael Collins, he liaised with an ex-servicemen's group to recruit men with particular military expertise who could fill specialised roles and also act as instructors. He later stated that he recruited a number of Irishmen who had served as officers in the British Army, and with them he was able to organise a training schedule for the different areas, especially at the Curragh. And he's shown here at the Curragh in early August 1922 with Michael Collins and other senior officers. Impelled by the urgent requirements of the Civil War, the process of upgrading the capabilities of the new regular army was greatly speeded up, and Dalton played an important part in this process. The British also supplied aircraft to equip the National Army's nascent military air service, a service for which Dalton had in fact laid the groundwork. When Michael Collins went to London for the treaty talks, there were fears that he might be under threat, and Dalton recruited 2 Irishmen who had national sympathies and who had served in the RAF, or the Royal Flying Corps, to buy a Martinsyde 4-seater aircraft so that Collins could make a quick escape back to Ireland in an emergency. The Martinsyde is a rather lopsided picture, but the Martinsyde is shown here, and it was named the Big Fella. Unfortunately, it no longer survives. Dalton would remain close to the 2 men, Jack McSweeney and Charlie Russell, and they went on to develop the new military air service. Commandant General McSweeney became head of the service, and Captain Russell flew the first Free State fighter aircraft into Baldonnel, a Bristol F-2B aircraft. Dalton was a strong believer in air support for his operations and, when possible, made use of aircraft to carry out reconnaissance on areas where opposing forces operated. Dalton was also a strong believer in the need for good intelligence about opposing forces. And in July, he complained bitterly to Defence Minister Richard Mulcahy that the Army's intelligence department was not functioning and that the matter needed to be urgently addressed. He didn't explain why he took this rather bleak view. He may have been concerned that there was not enough tactical intelligence on anti-treaty forces around the country, especially in the Munster region where they were strong. In July, as commander of Eastern Command, Dalton showed considerable organisational skill in rapidly deploying up to 1,000 men to occupy a range of positions to secure South Leinster, some elements encountering strong IRA resistance. Before his forces moved into certain areas, reconnaissance was carried out by the Military Air Service to check if roads were blocked or bridges destroyed and to report on the movements of enemy forces. Dalton established garrisons in local towns and, in addition to these static deployments, also organised flying columns to round up enemy fighters, placing an emphasis on mobility and on rapid reaction. Dalton had a personal role in the seizure of the County Wicklow town of Baltinglass and narrowly escaped death when a sniper's bullet shattered the steering wheel of the vehicle he was driving. This close call may have reminded him that a senior officer who exercises command and control functions should not put himself unnecessarily at risk. If he is killed or seriously wounded, he is of no use to his men. In early August, Dalton led one of the most significant operations of the Civil War, the seaborne invasion of Cork City and County. Previous successful landings had taken place in Mayo and Kerry, but the big prize now was the capture of the Republicans' Cork stronghold. The Republicans had obstructed the road and rail approaches to Cork, and while they were fully aware that the Free Staters could come in by the back door, i.e. the sea, they had a long coastline to defend with limited resources, and it was difficult to predict when or where the Free Staters might come storming ashore. The Cork operation emerged as the biggest of the landings in terms of the number of troops and ships deployed and the amount of heavy equipment transported. There was no well-developed planning department operating as part of GHQ staff that could draw up a blueprint for a major seaborne operation. Dalton, Collins and General Mulcahy seemed to improvise, to make it up as they went along, and they took chances. General Owen O'Duffy considered the landing strategy too dangerous. Troops were particularly vulnerable when going ashore, but the landings around the coast would prove successful. This time, luck was on the side of the Free Staters. Setting off from Dublin Port, Dalton commanded a force of more than 800 men in 4 ships, with field guns, armoured cars and armoured troop carriers. There seemed to be quite a joyous sense of adventure among the troops, and we see here some of them dancing together to the music of a melodeon on the deck. The troops were armed with Lee Enfield .303 rifles. A variety of other weapons were carried, as illustrated by a photo of 2 of Dalton's closest comrades in the army, General Tom Ennis and Commandant Pat McRae, who took part in the expedition. Ennis on the left is carrying a Thompson submachine gun and a German Mauser C96 semi-automatic pistol, often known as a Peter the Painter, while McRae is carrying in a holster a German Luger pistol. Dalton was with the main force that landed from 2 ships at Passage West in Cork Harbour. And we see him here on the left conferring with Tom Ennis on board the Arvonia. Another contingent landed at Youghal to the east and yet another at Union Hall to the west. At Passage West, Dalton quickly formulated a plan to take Cork City, which lay about 7 miles away, and troops began the advance. We can see here at Passage West the troops lined up, and a Lancia armoured troop carrier is towing an 18-pounder field gun. Communications with headquarters in Dublin were difficult. Telephone and telegraph lines had been cut by the anti-treaty forces. The wireless room in the Arvonia, on which Dalton sailed, had been damaged by IRA gunfire, and the wireless operator could send messages but not receive them. Charlie Russell, flying one of his colleagues in the military air service, Charlie Russell, flying a Bristol fighter, dropped a message to Dalton saying his communications were being received in Dublin and that reinforcements that he urgently demanded were on the way. But the container with the message drifted into the sea and was lost. Communications would remain a challenge for Dalton's forces in the Cork region. Dalton received some discreet assistance from Captain Hugh Somerville, the senior naval officer commanding the British naval forces in Cork Harbour. During recent research, I discovered that after consulting with Dalton, Somerville hired a tugboat, the Hellespont, to clear a hopper, the Onabway, that had been used by the IRA to obstruct the channel to Cork. Somerville later sent a tugboat bill for £18, 14 shillings and 3 pence to the Cork Harbour Commissioners, who agreed to pay. As Dalton's forces moved from Passage West towards Cork City, they encountered stiff IRA resistance at Rochestown and Douglas. At one stage, Dalton had to send forward troops to bolster the advance when some of his frontline forces began to waver. The National Army's artillery proved valuable. The Republicans who lacked field guns could defend positions against infantry attack, but not against artillery shells. The Free Staters' armoured cars and armoured troop carriers provided vital firepower and mobility. And we see here an example of one of the armoured car types that was landed. That's a Peerless, a very heavy armoured car. The Rolls-Royce Whippet was another type that was landed. IRA forces ultimately retreated to rural West Cork, and Dalton's men were unopposed as they occupied the city. Sadly, up to 20 men, National Army and anti-treaty, died in the fighting, and there was a couple of teenage brothers aged only 17 and 18 from Dalton's own district of North Dublin who were among the dead. After the landings, Free State forces found out to occupy the main towns. National Army soldiers held prisoner by the Republicans were liberated and rejoined the military. Members of the pro-treaty IRA were recruited, as were men who had served in the British Army in the Great War. Reinforcements arrived by sea, as did extra war material, including artillery shells. In Cork City, Dalton set up his headquarters in the leading hotel, the Imperial, and was welcomed by church leaders and local dignitaries. While focused mainly on the military campaign, he also paid attention to the strategy of winning hearts and minds. He placed a notice in the Cork Examiner saying that the national troops had entered Cork to preserve and restore the rights and liberties of the citizens. He engaged with the Catholic clergy and also with the Church of Ireland clergy. He set up an unarmed civilian police force which operated until the Civic Guard arrived in Cork. He also appointed to his staff a publicity officer, Lieutenant Barry. The Battle for Cork was the last major conventional engagement of the war and was a major setback for the IRA. Republican defenders were driven from the only important city they occupied. The conventional phase of the war was over, and anti-treaty forces reverted to guerrilla warfare. Just over a week after leaving Cork, Dalton had an unexpected visitor. On the Sunday, the 20th of August, National Army Commander-in-Chief Michael Collins arrived from Dublin with a convoy. Dalton recalled later that he warned Collins that being in the area was an unnecessary risk. Collins replied, "Nobody will shoot me in my own county." 2 days later, Dalton was travelling in Collins' touring car when their convoy was ambushed at Boyne near Bandon, and Collins was killed. Dalton and other shocked comrades escorted Collins's remains on a ship back to Dublin for one of the biggest funerals ever seen in the city. And we see here Dalton in the front row with senior officers at the funeral in Glasnevin of Collins. John Mulcahy is on the left there. As the IRA reorganized to ambush his forces and to carry out guerrilla attacks, Dalton felt under severe pressure. He had a big area to cover. Posts in isolated districts were vulnerable, and he constantly petitioned GHQ for additional men and material and for better transport facilities. Communications remained a problem with the ongoing disruption of telephone and telegraph services. In consultation with GHQ, arrangements were initiated to install wireless sets in various vulnerable garrisons so that assistance could be summoned if they came under attack. As Republicans reverted to guerrilla warfare, the advantage that Dalton's forces had enjoyed by deploying artillery now receded. Field guns were of little use in confronting guerrillas mounting surprise attacks or carrying out ambush operations, but there was at least one occasion when apparently the Army used artillery against the IRA. During a sweep to round up enemy fighters in the Ballingeary area, it was reported that the Army used artillery against irregulars, as they were called, concealed in caves on the mountainside. Dalton ensured that the military air service began operating from Fermoy airfield. A 3-aircraft unit flew from Baldoyle to Fermoy in early October, and work began on bringing the former British aerodrome back into operation. The pilots included Dublin-born James Fitzmaurice, seen here, an ex-RAF man who would win fame as one of the pilots on the Bremen for the first east-west flight across the Atlantic. Among other duties, the Fermoy airmen carried out reconnaissance of areas where the anti-treaty forces were active and provided air escorts to military convoys. Apart from the support from air support, Dalton also sought to make use of the modest maritime element of the National Army. He requested the use of the Helga, the gunboat which the British had provided to the provisional government as a fishery protection vessel, and the Helga duly landed troops under fire at Courtmacsherry on the 7th of September. When Dalton had captured Cork City, there was still a threat. While Dalton had captured Cork City, there was still a threat to his forces from sniper and other attacks. And it is noteworthy that when Dalton himself married his fiancée, Alice Shannon, in Cork on the 9th of October, for security reasons, the ceremony was held not in a church, but in the well-guarded Imperial Hotel where he resided and had his headquarters. By November, as GOC of Cork Command, Dalton oversaw 4 district commands, deploying forces with a strength of 3,220. He had considerable command responsibilities. Also under Dalton's command for operational purposes was the air service element in Fermoy. Towards the end of 1922, Dalton surprised many by leaving the Army. Decades later, in an interview, he said he was concerned about what would be required of him under new legislation prescribing the death penalty for irregulars for various offences. Frustrated and angry over the killing and wounding of his soldiers, he had lobbied for the death penalty, but when it was introduced, he seemed reluctant to go along with it. There may have been additional reasons that led Dalton to resign. Collins's death seemed to weigh heavily on him, and he was frustrated by what he saw as a lack of transport, equipment, and other support for his troops. In later life, he also expressed the belief that in leaving the Army, he was not letting the Free State down, as the war had essentially been won. He clearly considered that there was no way back for the Republicans after they were expelled from their last major stronghold. Dalton's service in the National Army was short-lived but significant. He was one of the officers who took over this barracks, then known as Portobello, when the British departed in 1922. He is shown here down at the gates of the barracks with other officers on the day when the British left and the national troops moved in. He was based in this barracks for a period and was one of the founding fathers of the Defence Forces. I think it is noteworthy that last month his daughter Audrey, a former Hollywood film star who was aged 88 years, travelled from America and was present here in Cahalbua Barracks as wreaths were laid in memory of her father's friend Michael Collins on the 100th anniversary of his death. She was warmly welcomed by the Chief of Staff and other officers and by former members of the Defence Forces who presented her with a framed photo of her father taken in the barracks 100 years before. I used this image during the PowerPoint presentation. She is shown here with Ronnie Daly in front of the Slievnaman armoured car that was with her father and Collins in the Valley of Bailnabla on that fateful day 100 years ago when Collins was killed. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sean. That was excellent. And it brings home the key role of Emmet Dalton in the seaborne landings, which, as Ewan said, essentially won the war, or at least a conventional phase of it.